What's up, gang? Thanks for joining the Undiplomatic Podcast, the show with undiplomatic takes about the foreign policy scene. I'm Van Jackson, and my guest today is a professor of labor studies at Rutgers University, author of so much good shit on labor history and labor strategy, including his latest book, We Are the Union, How Worker-to-Worker Organizing is Revitalizing Labor and Winning Big. Eric Blanc, welcome to the show, man. How are you?
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm doing okay. You know.
The end of the world. Um,
Yes.
so maybe if we can set the scene up front, the balance between capital and labor is, of course, wildly unbalanced. The fact that labor's weakness is a source of power for MAGA and US authoritarianism. It's kind of a problem. Maybe that needs articulating. But a lot of listeners of this show, they will have heard me talk about class politics as a lens on making sense of things, but they may not necessarily be familiar with the actual realities of the labor movement in America, by the numbers. So I wonder if there were some big macro trends that people need to know about organized labor in the US, like union density trends, right to work, Taft-Hartley, whatever. Could you give a kind of opening primer about
Yeah.
what you think is important on the terrain on which labor struggles?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing to say is the reason you should care about labor, even if you don't currently care about labor per se, is that, as you mentioned, all of the major crises of the U.S. and the world, really, I would argue, are deeply shaped by the power imbalance between workers and bosses. And so unions are the major mechanism through which working people have historically and still today countered that power imbalance by asserting their ability to redistribute wealth from above and have a voice at work. And
Mhm.
so if you look at MAGA, if you look at just, rampant imperial spending, if you look at climate catastrophe, all of these things are reflective of the fact that we have had essentially half a century, about 5 decades worth of union decline in this country since roughly the late 1970s. So what that means then is that union density, which is the percentage of the workforce that are in unions, in the 1950s, it was about 1 in 3 workers were in unions. Today, it's only 6% of the private sector workforce and only 10% of the total workforce when you include public sector workers. So you've just seen a really dramatic decline. And that has had repercussions not just for union members, but really across the board for American society, both in terms of rampant inequality. So I think, you can look at the most important graph to understand the situation we're in, I think, is the relationship between income inequality and union density. So union density goes up.
I've done a
Inequality.
thing on that specific graph before. Yeah.
Right, it's the graph to end all graphs, and so, we're there's a reason we're in an area of just rampant oligarchy, even before Trump was in power. But the good news is there is momentum, and energy to turn that around, but we're at a low point for sure as far as union strength.
Yeah, I mean, why? So, what happened in the 1970s to precipitate this continuous decline in union density that we live with now?
Yeah, was really the early 1980s, 1970, late 1970s peaks, and then essentially you have the combination of Reaganism plus deindustrialization and globalization as this one-two punch. So Reagan unleashes a one-sided class war by firing about 10,000 air traffic controllers, which incidentally, these were federal workers. And so it's, again, you see some of the
This is the
parallels
Patco
today.
strike.
This is
Yeah.
the PATCO strike. So this is a major turning point, which essentially signals to the employer class that they can just go all in on ignoring labor law and reversing decades of union gains and worker gains. So that you have combined with just major shifts in the economy in which the traditional unionized sectors get either sent abroad, Mexico, China, or just automated out of being a major economic player. And so in that context, the labor movement has yet to essentially figure out a new way to reverse those trends.
Yeah, I want to talk about manufacturing, and I think we're of the same mind on this, but I'm not sure. So I know you kind of debated this with Peter Olney, who's a very honorable, smart organizer, but he's my reading of him was that he's basically focused on a kind of choke point logic of you withdraw your labor at the point of production for mass goods, and then that's where your like key leverage is or whatever, which is very like that's kind of how it was in the 1930s, I guess. But like for reasons that maybe we'll talk about, I think it's not wrong, but it's not quite right, or it's like incomplete. What do you think of that? What do you have to say on manufacturing, I guess? And then we can go
Yeah,
from
I
there.
mean, there's a lot to say on manufacturing. The first thing I would say is against Trump, because Trump has this, you know, myth now that manufacturing jobs are necessarily good jobs. So he talks about, you're going to bring back manufacturing, we'll bring back 1950s middle class lifestyle. The reality is, manufacturing jobs, when they're not union, generally
They
suck. They
suck.
tend
Yeah.
they tend to be low wage. They tend to be extremely dangerous. And so you can just look at the U.S. South today. These are not like stable middle class jobs. These are really tough, very dangerous jobs because they don't have unions. So you need unions to make manufacturing jobs good jobs. I do think that there's something historically and still today strategic about manufacturing. It punches above its weight, if you want to think about it that way, in terms of both leverage for workers and its overall geopolitical impact. There's something there to this idea that manufacturing is particularly crucial. The problem is just that the percentage of the workforce that works in manufacturing today is less than 10%.
I was
And
gonna
so if you're
say, yeah.
basing yeah, so if you're basing your strategy for organizing working people just around these workers, many of whom are still union, it's extremely narrow. You're not going to actually have an answer for how you organize the vast majority of workers. And so you need to be able to provide answers to the service sector, essentially, which is where the vast majority of workers organize. And so it's not wrong to say that some of these workers have more leverage. I do think manufacturing workers tend to have somewhat more leverage, but again, that can be exaggerated because they lost a lot of their leverage with the threat of capital flight. So this, that leverage was undercut because when companies could say they were going to move to Mexico or China, workers got really scared to strike or to unionize. So there's a lot of mitigating factors, but I think the big answer is we need to be able to organize the whole economy and not just manufacturing and logistics.
Yeah, I mean, the two big things for me was like, one, in the capitalist world system today, advanced economies are necessarily service economies, like disproportionately, right, as a percent of GDP. But then the other thing is like, because of how the world system is structured, manufacturing is the only source of development potential, if you can even call it potential, the only like development ladder, if you will, for the rest of the world. The idea that we're going to take back manufacturing from the rest of the world and then do it here is this counterproductive thing. I think, even if you think that's possible, which I think you mentioned, if it's 10% of the economy, that's unrealistic to like rebuild the economy around manufacturing. It ignores reality. But the other self own about it is that if you're going to be a manufacturing based economy, you also have to be an export based economy. You have to. You have to have foreign markets. What foreign market is going to be able to buy the shit that you produce if you have taken their only means of growth away from them? It's this contradiction at the heart of like the manufacturing fetish. And I use fetish advisedly because, like you say, there is a logic to thinking about like punching above its weight is a great way to put it. Like manufacturing is a distinct kind of production from the worker's perspective that has some kind of potential that's different than other sectors. That doesn't mean it scales. That doesn't mean that you can just do manufacturing and it's not going to have
Especially
these
not in an age,
consequences.
yeah, especially not in an age with automation is so intense. So it's a different era than it was even 100 years ago as far as scalability for this.
Yes, don't get me started on AI. So, although we may need to have another conversation about that. So, you have this really important book, "We Are the Union," and some of what we've already talked about is kind of like in the book, but the big novelty, aside from some very good case studies that are like just rich with detail that I did not know, you have this idea or this observation about worker to worker organizing. What is that? And then what's it in contradistinction to? Like, what's the alternative?
Right. So again, to go back to the first thing we are saying, the big question is, how do we turn around the decades of union decline? And so that would literally require organizing tens of millions of workers. And the book is an attempt to answer and to address what would it actually take to organize tens of millions of workers? Is it possible? What are
A
the
scale
mechanisms?
problem. Yeah.
Yeah, and too often takes on the labor movement have talked just actually what it takes to win campaigns or this or that tactic, and all those things are important, but it's actually a distinct question of how to scale. And so the book is an attempt to answer that. And um, what I sort of counterpose, there's two forms of organizing. One is staff-intensive unionism, which has been the norm since the 1950s. It's still the norm, in which best practice is considered you need one staff person for every 100 workers. So it's a really, at its best, because it can be really effective, at its best, it relies on staff to help empower workers, and it can win. It can be really effective on a small scale, but the problem is it just can't win widely enough. There's just not enough money and there's not enough staffers in the country to organize tens of millions of workers this way. And so the labor movement's been stuck in this pattern of its best organizing being too small scale. And so worker to worker organizing essentially takes the best of that model, but takes the responsibilities that oftentimes full-time staffers have had to do and gives them to workers. So those are around three things. One is strategizing, so workers are able to make some of the big decisions about what to do. Second is initiating campaigns. It's not just the sort of established union deciding when and how to launch campaigns. And then third, workers are training other workers. So it's not just a full-time staffer, as is the norm right now, who will coach a new union drive in how to move forward. But oftentimes it'll be a worker themselves who's recently unionized. They've organized their shop and they jump on a Zoom call or meet up in person with another worker to help train them in how to organize. So the combination of those three attributes takes a lot of the responsibility into workers' hands, and it means it's a scalable model. You can just grow far more widely, and we've seen that. It's not just abstract. We've seen that in Starbucks. We've seen that in some of the case studies I look at in the book as well. You've seen it in auto, the UAW. And I argue that this is essentially the only path forward for the labor movement if we're going to reverse union decline.
It's funny because, like, separate from the analytical argument about whether this is more effective than centralized staffing model for organizing, there's something that is almost inspiring about thinking about worker to worker organizing. Like, there's a kind of like agency that's given to the actual workers themselves that is more potent. There's like any there's actually like a hopeful or psychological content to like that's a knock-on effect, if you will, that comes from like reframing labor unionization as like something that we do. It's
Right.
us, you know what I mean? Um,
Yeah, 100%. I think that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up because in some ways the book is actually as simple as a case for why you should organize your workplace, and that is part of the reason why I give these stories of workers organizing and
mhm,
self-initiating. And what you said is exactly right. Is it's not just so it's part of the reason it's scalable is that the process of unionizing, when you really own that effort, is transformative. And it changes the way you look at yourself. It changes the way you look at work. It changes the way you look at the world. And oftentimes it makes you kind of want to spread the Holy Spirit, right? The spirit of
yeah,
labor organizing. It's something. It's. I've seen this over and over and over again, where it's such a impactful experience to feel like you're something part of something bigger, that you have a way to make a mark on history, that even after these workers have organized their shop, oftentimes the next thing they want to do is go out and organize all of the shops nearby. They want other people to feel that same sense of empowerment and joy and solidarity that they've experienced. So yeah, in that sense, it's different than if you can win a union, but if it's sort of a slog and you feel like you're not actually in control, you're not going to be as willing and interested in going and getting the rest of your neighbors and people in your same company to go unionize as well.
yeah. Everything that I see Trump doing is class war from above. Like, his foreign policy is a form of class war. And if I'm right about that, then he's an enemy of the working class. Like, the math just can lead you only to that conclusion. And so I'm priming the pump a bit on this, but like, how do you see Trump's record on labor so far? And then maybe as part of that, we can talk about the federal workers because that's important too.
I mean, yeah, I agree with you. And I do think that Trump is much more vulnerable than people think precisely for this. The policies are very unpopular, and he's like a good campaigner, so he's able to lie. And frankly, the Democrats, were were ineffective or bad enough on enough issues, plus inflation, that there's a lot of low information voters who were looking for anything other than the status quo,
Yeah.
right? But he's pissed away that support through not just the tariffs and the economic bungling, but by making it really clear that this is an administration of and for the richest people on the planet. And I think that's why his poll numbers are plummeting, and I think it creates the basis for not just an electoral backlash, but for far more sustained backlash from below, which we've already started to see. So the hands-off protests, I think, were very
Hmm.
big, but I think that's just the tip of the iceberg if and when they try to continue going after working class benefits like Medicaid and things like that. On unions specifically, Trump has been the most anti-union president in modern U.S. history. He overnight, through an executive order, attempted to take away union rights from 1 million federal workers. Through an executive order overnight, just saying, "Oh, sorry, you don't have collective bargaining anymore." And right now, that's being held up in the court somewhat. But that, if you just think about going back to what we were talking about before with Patco, Reagan fired 10,000 workers, unleashing class war from above against the whole working class. 1 million workers,
This
like
is
think about it.
orders of magnitude more
Orders of magnitude,
aggressive.
1
Yeah.
million right? And because every employer in the country is looking what Elon Musk is doing to the federal workers and saying, could I get away with that? Right? Could I force out or fire half the workforce and make everyone else stay and work double the amount of work for the same pay or lower with no benefits and no job security? Like every company would do that if they could. And so it's a question of whether there's enough backlash to force the Trump administration and Musk to back off, or at a minimum to create such backlash that even if in the short term they're able to impose these cuts, that at least the rest of the employers aren't going to go start do the same everywhere else. And so the stakes are pretty high, not just for the federal workers, we can talk more about, but really I would say for the whole working class.
Yeah, there's an interesting costly signaling reputational thing going on with like punishing violations of workers' rights and labor law versus not punishing them, or setting the price of punishment on for labor violations on corporations too low, like pricing it too low, because it's big firms violate they're guilty of violating labor law all the time. Sometimes they get fined for it and sometimes they don't. But if you're in Amazon, think about the cost that you would have to pay by redistributing surplus value back to workers compared to paying a fine of a couple $100 million because you hired a bunch of Pinkertons to do some illegal shit, or you illegally fired a bunch of people who were trying to organize their workplace because they were trying to organize their workplace. Like the penalty that firms face maybe should be higher, but
that is an understatement of the century. Yes.
yeah. And so they're happy to pay the fine if they have to, but maybe they don't even have to, right? And so it matters a lot. I mean, where the administration is on this stuff, but also how much power they give over to the National Labor Relations Board, and there's ways to stack the deck against labor. I'm not super high on Biden or anything, but he wasn't anti-labor in the way that the Trump administration appears to be. And I don't
Yeah,
know.
I think Biden, for all of his crimes, frankly, around Palestine, was in fact good on labor in the U.S. I just think it has to be said is that he appointed Jennifer Abruzzo to head the National Labor Relations Board, and she was amazing. She was frankly as good. You could not have asked for anybody better. She was like a fighter for the working class, and that made a real difference in these drives to Starbucks, Amazon, and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's contradictory, right? For all of Biden's limitations and weaknesses, the union piece, at least on the U.S., really was a strong point. And I think that's important because it shows that it does matter who's in office. Sometimes some leftists say, "Well, it doesn't really matter; they're all the same." Well, I don't think that's true. It does matter. There's a reason why we're on the defensive right now when
Mhm.
Trump's in office. Whereas when the Democrats, even if it's a corporate Democrats are in power, you have more space to go on the offensive. And so strategically, it does matter which terrain you're operating under. It doesn't mean they're going to be on your side by, automatically, or that you can rely primarily on those mechanisms of sort of institutional labor relations. They're not powerful enough, even under Biden, to like force Starbucks to grant union the first contract, or as you mentioned, to force Amazon to recognize the union. So they just break labor law because the penalties are so low. It's That's why organizing is the main piece, but the legal terrain is an important factor to sort of additionally.
Yeah, in your book, you talk about two separate concepts which are important. One is salting, which is classic tactic, something I actually encourage young people to do. But you also talk about seeding. I mean, so what are these two things and how are they different?
Salting is a crucial tactic, something I'm really involved in supporting right now, and I'll give folks a way to get plugged in. But
Emergency workplace organizing committee, baby.
yeah, and so what salting is basically is you get a job at a workplace with the goal of organizing it. You get the job knowing that you're going to try to build a union there. So yeah,
Which
this
it
is
should
historic.
it should be said that's a fucking hard thing to do. Like
Oh yeah, it's
it's
not easy.
noble work that is hard.
Yeah, it's not necessarily easy work, but I would say if you're a young person in particular who is just sort of heartbroken about the state of the world and is trying to figure out how to make a change, this is one of the most important things you can do. The other is to organize your own workplace. But so if you can't organize your own workplace, or maybe you don't want to, you can get a job at Starbucks, you get a job at Amazon, you could get a job at an auto factory, wherever, that's strategic. And sort of there's a lot of projects that can help you figure out how to start organizing your coworkers. So that's what salting is. I would actually say, before forget, if any of you are listening and want to get involved, there's a new project called Workers and Organizing Workers, which you can sign up to. It's a salting project. You can sign up. You just go to bit.ly, so bit.ly/salt now. So bit.ly/salt now. And you just put your name there, and they'll get you connected to Starbucks or Amazon, wherever locally would work for you to get organized in these big campaigns. So that's salting. And that played an important role, very important role, in initiating the Starbucks campaign. It was Salts initiated the Starbucks campaign and helping support the Amazon organizing, and a lot of these other drives. Seeding is different. Seeding is essentially you spread as widely as possible tools for workers to start self-organizing. So that can look like a lot of different things. It can be something like organizing mass online organizing trainings that anybody can go to so that they can learn how to organize their workplace. It can be doing viral social media videos about workers unionizing or walking out, and then having at the end a link for how people could organize their workplace. It can be what the UAW, the auto workers, did when they went out on strike in the fall of 2023. People might remember they had this very successful strike, and they used having the spotlight on them. The whole country was watching them, to say, okay, we're not only going to win it for these workers who are in our union, we're calling on all auto workers in the South, all across the country, to start unionizing. So they gave the inspiration and gave tools for people to start self-organizing. So that's what seeding is. And my argument in the book is you essentially need both of these things. You need both targeting, but unlike and seeding, because unlike in the past, in the 1930s, where you could really just focus on targeting, the political economy has changed so much. And this goes to the question we were talking about before, manufacturing and the service sector, that you can't just focus on these strategic sites. You actually have to spread much more widely out. And that's why seeding is so important.
Man, that's really good clarifying. Um, your book is like highly praised. I highly recommend it. It's rightly praised. Like, frankly, I wouldn't have asked you on the show. It was a bitch to get this one scheduled, and like I wouldn't have had you on if I didn't want to talk to you. Like, I only talk to people that are interesting to me. But like the book, the argument is not like universally adopted, or like there are the odd critics. What is the perspective of somebody who resists your argument?
Yeah, there's a few different
I mean, there are
ones.
bad faith versions, but what's like a good faith disagreement?
One of the good faith disagreements is that labor law is so broken. This is the strongman argument. Is basically labor law is so broken in the United States that even if you adopt this new organizing model, it's going to be still impossible to scale because employer opposition is so high. To actually organize tens of millions of workers, according to this theory, you'd need labor law reform first or together with it. Because as long as the terrain is so unfavorable for workers, you're not going to be able to organize at scale. That's one argument. And so I can respond to that if you're interested. Another argument is that, it's a little bit what we were talking about before, is that in talking about organizing so widely, and seating and all of this, you're not focusing enough on the most strategic workers. And so their argument would be you should focus on the workers that have the most leverage, they have the most power. And if you focus there, then that can inspire the rest of the workforce to unionize. But unions have only limited resources and time, so you should focus your fire just on the most sort of powerful workers economically. I would say that those are the two major arguments that I've encountered, and I think there's significant grains of truth to both of them, and I try to address them in the book. And in the short version in response is on the legal terrain. Well, there's two things. The first is there's no world in which the legal terrain is going to get changed unless there's mass organizing, making unions the headline news and a political crisis.
Yeah.
Because in what world are the Democrats or Republicans
Just gonna wake up
going
and
to?
do the right thing. Like,
Yeah, I mean, and so I do think labor law is really reform is really important, but we've had half a century now of the Democrats getting elected, promising to do labor law reform and not doing it. So unless you can make it the top issue, where they feel like they're going to get elected out of office, they're going to get they're going to get booted out of office unless they follow through on their campaign pledge. Well, then the Democrats aren't going to do it, especially because there's going to be big employer opposition. So part of the answer is you need wide-scale organizing to even get labor law reform. And the second I would say is that, we actually don't know how far unions could grow on this terrain because most unions aren't actually investing in new organizing. There's this perception from the outside that, well, if unions have been declining for all of this time, presumably that just must be for structural reasons, right? It must just be because there's something about the economy. Maybe it's because of the service sector that means that unions can't grow in this new terrain. But we actually don't have any way of testing that because most unions aren't even trying to grow. The vast majority of unions spend no money on external growth. They're just hunkered down servicing their own members. And so we don't actually have the test case for how far it could grow in this terrain until unions start investing in new organizing. And we've seen enough examples of unions that do invest in new organizing winning to suggest that it's a viable model even under this terrain. And then on the second point, where I think I already addressed it before, which is just that there aren't enough strategically central workers in this way that there was in the 1930s that you can just only focus on the most economically powerful. It's just there are too few of them that you need to be able to organize much more widely if you're going to organize the working class as a whole. And frankly, some of the non-strategic or less strategic workers can be a boost for creating the energy, enthusiasm, and sort of labor army necessary to take on an Amazon or to take on auto. It might have to be that you're first organizing at Starbucks or grad schools or your local bakery, whatever it is. That might be the entry point for people into the labor movement, and you're going to need some of that accumulated momentum and strength, I think, if you're going to take on the biggest companies in the world.
yeah, that makes sense. So I focus a lot on like the intersection of we're trying to relate national security and to labor power. And the way I read all this is those two forces are highly antagonistic to each other. I mean, basically around the world, but also in the US. And like it's almost like there's a national security constraint that is like it's outside the scope of your work here, but it's this cloud, this overhanging thing that is like the dystopian veto card on the labor movement. And
Mhm.
for me, it's like it's actually the reason why choke point law. It's like this soft underbelly of choke point arguments because it's like if you're actually going to threaten capital in that kind of targeted, acute way, all it takes is the president to be like national emergency, fuck you, and that's some evil shit. In the structural sense, I don't think you can build labor power to the scale that's needed if you don't also rein in the national security state, if your economy is still basically held hostage to military Keynesianism.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's a really crucial point, and I'm glad you bring that up because it is ultimately maybe the strongest argument against just this narrow focus on choke points. I used to work on the docks. I worked for a couple of years in the Bay Area on the docks,
Oh,
and only a couple of years after I got a couple of years before I got hired, our jobs had been essentially put under when Bush came into power. came under Homeland Security, where they after 9/11, right? So after
Yeah.
9/11, all of a sudden, dock workers' jobs, you were part of this, this very elaborate national security apparatus. And so it took a huge amount of time for me to get the job, because you have to go through all of these, are you a terrorist and all of this stuff. You're in the system for that. All of that is to say that the context in which that happened was also dock workers had a tradition of doing, militant
Yeah.
disruptions, and it becomes much harder if there was something really sustained. It wouldn't be very difficult for the government just to essentially come in and militarize the ports to make sure that arms manufacturing going out. It's not to say that you shouldn't still try to do that. I think you should around Israel right now. I think it's good to
Sure.
try to put pressure on this, and there's wins you can make, but especially if it's coming against the U.S. like ability, its security apparatus and its military apparatus, in which you're really challenging them directly, they're gonna use their full armed might to try to isolate a few really strategic workers.
So don't put all your eggs in that basket or whatever.
Right, because they're not stupid. They're just like, oh, okay, well, too bad the whole economy and our entire war machine has been shut down.
Oh,
I
shucks.
wish we'd considered that. And so what would prevent them from being able to do that is if you have a very widespread movement, and the political cost of doing something like that would be too high. So that's one aspect of it, is that you're right that they do have an ability to prevent that type of choke point. And the more general piece I would say is this is something that the labor movement in the US has never actually been able to find a real way out of, which is to say that the labor movement in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s really in some ways did benefit from military Keynesianism. It was in the context of a lot of the factories. What got us out of the Great Depression was in large part war production.
Yeah.
And so the unions in part saw their future, particularly in manufacturing, as integrally dependent on imperial expansion and ambitions and the war economy. And so that's part of the reason why anti-communism was so strong in the labor movement, and why, frankly, the labor movement in the U.S. had extremely questionable foreign policy. This is the
This
nicest
is
way you can
what
say it.
killed the labor movement, though, is like AFL-CIO becomes this agent of empire
Mhm.
that goes around weakening labor abroad, and then that's where capital relocates to fuck you over because you're too
Right, exactly.
expensive.
Right, exactly. So it becomes a totally a self-defeating dynamic in which the labor movement in the US actively undermines essentially third world liberation and radical movements in, underdeveloped countries. And then once those are defeated, think about Vietnam or much of Latin America, then it becomes easier for capital to relocate because labor is cheaper and the regimes are more docile. So yeah, the labor movement fortunately has broken from the worst of that, but that is a tradition that is still,
Lingers. Yeah.
it lingers, and it lingers even with Biden. Part of the reason that Biden was decent on labor and was decent on sort of rebuilding sort of a labor policy is competition with China, right? And so it's a very contradictory situation in which that might create openings for labor in the same way that, frankly, some of Trump's shenanigans might create opportunities for labor. It's possible, like if it's harder for capital to go to Mexico, that might make it easier to organize factory workers in the U.S. But it's a very, very slippery slope from using those openings to then seeing yourself as in your fate is essentially reliant on the U.S. imperial state, and that has
Mhm.
led to ruin. And I hope we wouldn't go down that road again. But it's difficult.
Yeah. Shifting gears slightly, you had this other book, Red State Revolt, about the teachers' strikes, and I read only snippets of it, but I wanted to get your thoughts about teachers' unions because, like, the one I'm most familiar with is the Chicago Teachers Union. So they have these like famous strikes in 2012, 2019, 2022, like quite successful. What was the key to their success? Like, is there something? What is it? Is there something that's generalizable there also?
Yeah, two things. One is that they were very explicit about connecting their struggle to essentially the broader interests of working people in the city. So they framed it wasn't just that they were striking for better wages, they were fighting for the schools that students deserved, right? And so this is, in part because they're public sector workers,
Mhm.
and so they're providing these services. But I think there's a broader lesson there. Certainly if you're a federal worker now, thinking about how you would win, but more generally, the labor movement needs to be seen by the public as the major force fighting for all working people, and not just sort of the special intriguers fighting for its own members. And so the CTU really pioneered and popularized this different way of organizing called bargaining for the common good, where you're sort of fighting for the interests of all working people. That's one thing. And the second I would say is that there's a lot of reds, there's a lot of radicals in those unions, and that's a good thing. It took a lot of socialists and lefties to kick out the old leadership and to infuse the union with a more fighting spirit. So I do think this goes back to maybe the last question is when the left gets kicked out of unions, in the 1950s with McCarthyism, that really weakens the labor movement. And it's only really since CTU and now
Mm.
post Bernie, in which you have young leftists sort of reinfusing the labor movement with a more militant spirit, that you're starting to see a more vigorous, grassroots, inspiring labor movement again.
That's a good point. I also kind of wonder if making a union pitch or a strike pitch as part of your community, you're embedded in your community, you have popular support. I wonder if that actually also insulates you from like, police state tactics of repression. Like the boot doesn't has a harder time coming down on you because like you're part of a whole.
Yeah, no, that's entirely. I mean, that's entirely right. That, and the whole history of the labor movement is indicative of that, which is to say that the biggest strikes that won in the U.S., the sort of turning points, were not just because the workers were powerful, but because they had community support, and not just sort of latent community support, like the polls said that they were, supportive, but they had thousands and tens of thousands of people on the picket line. Because when that's the case, politicians are more wary to go in and break up your strike because they're worried about getting kicked out of office or making them making themselves look bad. And so yeah, you do need that active community support, I think, particularly in the public sector, but really more generally as well.
You have this great newsletter where you're kind of it's almost like reading you thinking in real time about a lot of labor issues or working out your own arguments maybe ahead of time. And like one of the things that you pointed me to as a reader in that was some academic research that showed that the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020 actually led to an upsurge in labor militancy. Like somebody actually traced the connection and there was connection. But I was wondering if you had thoughts about the relationship of like social movements to labor unionism or the unity or tension between those things.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one of the things we've seen in recent years is that a lot of the people who organized their workplace had some experience in other social movements. So Black Lives Matter, as you mentioned, was the number one thing that I found in the interviews, and I did a survey of every union drive of 2022. And yeah, Black Lives Matter came out number one. Bernie Sanders was the second most. So if you consider that a social movement, which it felt like certainly
Kind
to a
of,
lot of
yeah.
people, then that fed into it. And then also LGBTQ issues, people who sort of gotten politicized through those issues, particularly at Starbucks, but not just that. And so there is something about social movements can be an entry point into critiques of society. And then what I found a lot is that workers who went through these movements, got a radical critique of society, were trying to figure out, well, how to win. Like, where's our leverage come from? What is the mechanisms through we can actually reverse institutional racism, through which we could actually address climate change, through which we could actually elect somebody like a Bernie Sanders? And that raises the question of power. And that's essentially why the labor movement is so important, and why so many of these workers who had been in other social movements and without dropping the importance of those issues in their mind, got involved in workplace organizing, precisely because they saw that that was the place where they could have the most amount of impact. That's where they could have the power in order to fight for all of these issues. That's part of the way I look at the relationship with social movements, is that they're oftentimes an entry point into activism, whose sort of final resting place for a lot of people ends up being the labor movement, because that's where people find it's they're most effective. But yeah, there has to be a reciprocal dynamic. I think right now, for instance, under Trump, you know, we need not just a stronger labor movement, but there should be, there should be people getting arrested in front of the ICE buses. I remember as far as immigration goes, I used to get, we used to do civil disobedience all of the time under Obama, when Obama was doing mass deportations. And so there is this level of urgency, I would say, at this moment for mass sort of protests and social movements, regardless of whether it's the labor movement. But if you
Mhm.
have that type of mass protest, something on the scale Black Lives Matter, but against Trump, which is I think essentially what we need, like a mass outpouring. That does need to be channeled into leverage points, and I think that the labor movement is going to be the best place to sort of give a ongoing, sustained escalation to bring down Trump and Trumpism generally.
Hmm. Well said. Yeah. I guess the final question, Shawn Fain, head of the UAW, he has been promoting very smartly this like mega strategy or something for a general strike, May Day 2028. I mean, maybe you can say a word about what a general strike is because it's so foreign to Americans at this point. But like, do you think it's really going to happen? Like, this is a big, bold thing.
First of all, so a general strike is when workers across different industries, sometimes all industries, or at least various industries, strike together, and so you can shut down large parts of society.
It's
This,
not uncommon outside the US, just
yeah, outside the
here,
U.S., I mean, even in U.S. history, you had general strikes all the time.
Yeah.
Up through the 1930s, you had all sorts of general strikes, and so it's just worth saying that the reason that a general strike is a really important goal to aspire to is that society can't function without our labor. So this is the basic intuition of general strike: is that no institution, no public agency, no company could function. Cities, when just the basic functionality would come to a halt without workers working. Okay, so that's a huge amount of power we have potentially. Getting to that power is the trickier part, and I feel like I would love to see a general strike in 2028. I'm skeptical that we're going to get there at this moment unless unions can start actually fighting against Trump and putting, not just waiting until 2028, but if unions can't do what they should be doing right now against Trump, we're never going to get enough of the energy and momentum through which you could have something like a general strike. And so I think we just need to have a very sober analysis of how far we are from that. And that is, it is sobering because frankly, the vast majority of unions, even in the face of an authoritarian coup in which the richest people on earth are taking over the government, the vast majority of unions are just really focusing on the legal route, which is good. It's good that there's these lawsuits, but it's totally insufficient. It's just totally insufficient for actually defeating these attacks. And so, if you can't even get the labor movement to go all in on mobilizing for May Day this year, just a protest, to get people to go all out for the hands off rallies, at most they sent an email, but there's 14 million union workers in the U.S. Like, what would it take to get half of them out? If you had half of them out, that would be the biggest protest in under Trump. Just that half of the labor movement. And so, unless you can even get that type of energy going for something relatively more simple like a mass protest, I don't think you're going to see something like a general strike. And so, we have to fight really hard within our unions to push them to be more militant, to take more risks, and to not feel like the Democrats are going to come save us, because that is still, frankly, the overall orientation of most union leaders, is to either ignore everything in the world and just kind of focus on their own fiefdom, or feel like somehow just electing the Democrats next time around is going to resolve everything. And I think the fact that we are in the dire situation we are in today is in large part a result of that strategy not working.
Yeah, I think it's very smart to try and align renegotiating contracts across sectors so that it's timed together so that you could strike together. Like, that's a real smart thing to try to do, a tactic. It sure as shit is not enough. The emergency is now. Like, who knows what's going on in 2028? Like, we have, I mean, fascism, call it something else if you're more comfortable with it, but, like, that's what's happening right now, and it's like, if you can't mobilize against this, it's like how Naomi Klein said Gaza blew a hole in our moral universe, and so now it's like everything gets through. We can't mobilize for shit because we didn't mobilize for the worst thing. We've got collective action problems right now. The labor movement needs to be fighting at a level right now that it's not, including probably, I mean, I don't know how you feel about this, but like even illegal, like wildcat strikes, like just stuff that has been off the table for us in during my lifetime, I think. And but now, I mean, it's emergency time.
Yeah, I mean, it is emergency time. I think that, maybe taking back to what we talked a lot about earlier about air traffic controllers. Like, just think about the emergency of Newark. It's like, my wife doesn't want to fly out of Newark. I live in New York City, and the head of the Department of Transportation won't have his wife fly out anyway, because this is a government that is systematically undercutting the basic services on which we depend. And so this does raise a question of like, okay, are the workers at, are these air traffic controllers? Well, maybe they have to not work for a little while to force the government to back down from its authoritarian ambitions and to back down from its cuts to the whole federal sector. Like, what would happen if air traffic controllers, did a slowdown? Or, what would happen with the TSA workers? What would happen with the teachers? All across the board, there's workers who have a lot of leverage. And I do think that there's all sorts of steps that could be taken that are not being in a really serious way floated by the leadership. But fortunately, the way this normally plays out is the ranks lead and then the leaders follow. And so we saw that in the teacher strikes, to go back to one thing that you mentioned before. In 2018, the biggest strikes we've seen in decades, the first strike wave in decades, happened because rank and file workers took the initiative in red states. So, this shows you can happen even when Republicans are in power. Red states, strikes were illegal, unions didn't have collective bargaining, and nevertheless, the workers won by striking in large numbers, and they had the community support. So I think it's going to take that kind of initiative from below to force the labor movement into fighting against Trump with all of its might. And I think that that's feasible now because Trump is so unpopular. It's a very explosive situation. And so I think Trump is really playing with fire, but it's going to take a lot of organizing from below. So yeah, folks hopefully should get involved in salting. I gave the link earlier to that. But if you want to organize your own workplace, as you mentioned before, the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee, that's a really great way to get plugged in. You just go to workerorganizing.org, and you fill out a form there. And then an experienced organizer will get in touch with you within 72 hours to help you start organizing your workplace. And so I think the combination of those sort of two steps would be a really good way for any listeners to get involved in the labor movement to defeat Trumpism in that sense.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll try to throw those in the show notes too, the links. Eric Blanc, man, this was really rich. Thanks for coming on the show. This was great.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate you having me on. Appreciate all your work.
Take care.